How does this emerging strategy, if you can call it that, from Washington fit in with the pretty clear strategy from Wang Yi, basically saying there should be a dual-track approach where the US and the ROK freezes their military exercises in return for a freeze of ballistic missile testing and nuclear testing by the DPRK in return for a pathway to talks? Could you see them both working together, these strategies?
I think, that's the right strategy to move forward. Remember, military option is not the option because it is easy to start a war or military conflict. It's very hard to end it, to conclude it. And also remember, North Korea is different from Syria, different from Afghanistan, different from Iraq. So, and the only way to solve this problem is actually diplomacy, diplomatic solution, talks. But the thing is, we have seen this emerging U.S. policy toward the new policy toward North Korea, that's so-called maximum pressure and engagement. We have seen pressure growing, but we haven't seen engagement yet. That's the part not clear. And I think in the U.S., I'm not sure, the calling from Beijing is like two suspicions. The U.S. and South Korea should also suspend their military drills every year, as long as the North Korean suspend their military, their nuclear tests. The thing is, I'm not sure Washington is listening to that. So there's a need a lot of discussion between Beijing and Washington to cooperate, to coordinate their policy toward North Korea to produce the maximum amount of outcome in terms to in order to solve this problem.
A follow-up, do you think that if the U.S. was started to move and try and impose heavier sanctions, be it through the United Nations or elsewhere, I'm talking perhaps an oil embargo, toughening up on search and seizure of ships, that Beijing could go along with that as well?
I would say it's likely that Beijing will go along with that because there's a genuine concern, there's a serious concern, I would say, within China. There's a lot of discussion about how threatening the situation is to China, especially northeast part of China. Remember, all those nuclear test sites is within 300 kilometers away from the Chinese border. Sometimes is within 100 kilometers away. So every time there's a military test, there's earthquake on the Chinese border, on the Chinese side of the border. So you can see the concern from the Chinese people. And also, if there's a leaking of the nuclear weapons, China would be the first one, the first country to be affected in a very bad way. I think the Chinese leaders understand that. They know this is a serious situation. You have to solve this situation. So they are working very hard on their own side and also with the United States.
Jonah, you're an anthropologist among lots of other things. So I'm going to ask you, DPRK's reaction in all this is key. We have seen no movement whatsoever in terms from Pyongyang, despite all the different parts of this strategy being thrown at the wall. In fact, we saw a ballistic missile test over the weekend, although it failed, or perhaps they aborted it, or something else. It's not Iraq, it's not Syria, it's not Afghanistan. What is it? And how do you think the US should approach it?
Those are good questions. From an anthropological standpoint, I think that the foreign policy community in the US, as in many other countries, often fails to take into account the fact that different societies are different. Different leaders are obviously different, but when the US president thinks he can simply sit down with Kim Jong-un and negotiate with him as if he were a corporate executive, that's missing a huge part of what's going on inside Kim Jong-un's head. This is a society, North Korea, that has been essentially cut off from the rest of the world for nearly half a century. And it has bred this insularity and this cult of the Kim family that is very difficult for an outsider to get their head around. I think one of the things we have to remember is that this state of crisis that North Korea is putting forward is pretty close to normal life for them.
Do you think that's the case, Yonho Kim, that the DPRK can withstand this pressure? It's been here before. And what do you think the ROK, the South Korean policy, will be after the election in terms of squaring with the Trump administration? Because it's starting to see there's some light between the two allies.
Right. Kim Jong-un has been pursuing a so-called Pyeongjin policy, pursuing both economic and nuclear developments. And so far, a lot of people hate to admit it, but Kim Jong-un has been pretty much successful.
It's working.
It's working.
There's a lot of capital in the economy moving around.
Right. And everybody is admitting to the huge progress Kim Jong-un made on the nuclear front. But when it comes to the burgeoning market economy in North Korean style, not many people are actively discussing for various reasons. But obviously, so far, at least, the international economic sanctions have not been that successful in terms of squeezing the North Korean economy. And in addition to that, the leading front runner of South Korean presidential candidate, Moon Jae-in, almost certainly to get elected on May 9th. He's very eager to have reconciled and restored the relationship with the North. And he has been criticizing former President Park Geun-hye's decision to close Kaesong Industrial Complex.
Which is the shared industrial zone where DPRK would make stuff for export, and it was a transit point too. Right. So you could see the sunshine policy coming back, as it was known on the peninsula?
Not exactly as we saw in the past, because the sunshine policy has been criticized for giving too much at no cost to North Korea. So there should be very strict conditions, I think. Even Moon Jae-in becomes the next president. But obviously, he's aiming at even expanding Kaesong Industrial Park.
Sourabh, do you see that as the way to go? I mean, could we get to that point, considering where we are at the moment?
I absolutely think this is the best way forward. And if there is going to be a game changer on the Korean Peninsula, it will be about the DPRK getting its economic engine right, of expanding private markets, of not having to depend externally on food aid. If it can get that part right, it creates incentives for outsiders to be able to help to actually help the DPRK go down that path and become a bit more prosperous, which might leaven some of those tendencies there. It also opens up scope for leverage in that case, where sanctions against the DPRK actually do have some effect because he is internationally engaged. But I think it's very important, and I think China will go down this path where it will sanction the North Koreans in terms of certain strategic commodities if it behaves poorly, that is North Koreans, the Kim Jong-un regime. But if the Kim Jong-un regime can exercise minimum discipline and behavior and can get private markets working, the Chinese would be only too happy to ensure that that North Korea can prosper economically and can open up greater avenues in terms of larger four-party or six-party conversation in that context.
Qinduo, the point taken that the DPRK economy is growing and perhaps sanctions won't work, though, but China is banning coal imports. It's cracked down on other industries, tightening the UN Security Council sanctions, which are broad. Is this a policy that that China is happy to follow for the time being until we see results, or is there a timeline where obviously talks and some sort of diplomacy will need to happen and sanctions get lightened?
Well, I think the policy will go on. China will follow the UN sanctions as long as there are sanctions. I mean, even the sanctions are, becoming more severe on the North Korean side, because obviously China is not accepting further nuclear ties from North Korean side. However, whatever the situation may be from the United States, whatever policy from the United States, China will not accept that. That's for sure. That's a fact. And also, and I would say the policy will go on until there's engagement from the U.S. side, until there are like ripe conditions for all the parties involved to reach a certain agreement to help not really to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, but at least if we can put the weapons development on hold, that would be good enough. And then we can see where we can go from there.
Quick follow-up. The relationship between President Xi and President Trump, at least according to President Trump, seems to be one of the closest he's developed. Is that helping?
Yes, I think that's very encouraging. Actually, there's a discussion in China from the think tanks. They would encourage China to do more, actually, to contain the ambition from the North Korean side, and also to work more closely with the U.S. side. They would encourage the two countries to work together in a well-coordinated way to leave no room to be exploited by the North Korean side. If there is a discrepancy between Beijing and Washington, and then the North Korean leadership can make good use of that, that's not good for the purpose of denuclearization in the peninsula.
Thanks so much. Last word to Yonho Kim. What should we look out for over the next days and weeks going forward to give us signals of where this DPRK tensions are going?
I think everybody is looking at at North Korea, whether they are going to do any further provocations. And a
nuclear test. That could be a red line, right?
Right.
Trump kind of hinted at that in the interview that we played at the top.
He wouldn't be very happy about that. And I think North Korea has been very careful in terms of not conducting nuclear tests, although they have been throwing out very harsh statements about the U.S. But when you carefully read their statements, it sounds very defensive. They have been talking about hostile U.S. policies or U.S. provocations. So as long as there's no so-called U.S. provocations, North Korea seems to be happy with the current situation.
Yonho Kim, thanks so much. Thanks, Sourabh, as well. Jonah here in the studio, and Qinduo from Beijing. That's all we have time for on this edition of The Heat.